Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm your host, Jared Zimmer, the Director of Outreach and Mission here at Word on Fire. And as always, a warm welcome to Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, it's good to be with you again.
Hey, Jared, how you doing? How are all the kids?
Doing well, growing like weeds.
That's good. I'm glad.
Yeah. Well, I know recently you were able to partake in a symposium with William Lane Craig discussing culture and the relationship between faith and reason and science and numerous different topics, and it was live streamed on Facebook. Can you kind of fill us in on how that went and what you thought really stood out?
Yeah, it was a great experience. It was organized by some good people at Claremont McKenna University outside of LA. And we've been talking for about a year about this possibility because I'm out here, permanently, and then he comes for a couple of weeks every January. So we got our schedules together. And I've been an admirer of William Lane Craig for a long time. He's the greatest of the Christian warriors in the struggle with the new atheists. So go on YouTube sometime and look up his name, and his debates with Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris will come up. So I've admired him for a long time. I also, disagree with him on a number of intellectual issues. So we structured the day where in the afternoon, we got about 30 or so academics around the table, and he and I both gave papers. Craig and I gave papers, then responded to each other. And then we had a wide-ranging conversation. So it was good, pretty high-level, intense academic conversation. Then in the evening, what we live streamed was this conversation between the two of us about, as you say, culture, evangelization, the church. And it was not meant to be a debate, so it wasn't in that format, but really kind of two, in many ways, like-minded people talking about these challenges. So it was a great day. I loved it. I'd met him very briefly some years before, but now I had a chance to really get to know him, and it was a splendid day.
Yeah, I really noticed just the incredible difference between a debate and really this kind of ecumenism in its best form of talking about us as Christians together. And even though we certainly have theological disagreements and the like, but in terms of this rise of secularism, it was a beautiful thing to watch, of seeing two people on the same team going towards the same end.
Yeah, and I think we both have that sense that we have a common enemy today. So Catholics and Protestants could talk forever about the 16th century debates, and they're important. I don't want to sideline those, but now we've got a common enemy in this rampant secularism and this distaste for religion in so much of the culture. So I think we kind of became comrades in arms in some ways the other night. But it was just an instructive, interesting, friendly, and I hope inspiring evening for people.
Praise God. So for today's episode, we're going to continue our discussion about, the topics that are really our evangelical ethos. These are the 8 principles on which we guide our mission as an apostolate. And if you've picked up a copy of Bishop Barron's latest book, To Light a Fire on the Earth, you might recall that in one of the last chapters, Bishop Barron discusses pretty thoroughly the desire to see Word on Fire grow into an evangelical movement. And so really what these principles act as are really the foundations of the movement, really principles that would guide both our daily life, our spirituality, but then also how we form our apologetics, how we form our evangelization strategy, how to partake in this call to the new evangelization. And we've already discussed 6 of the other principles, those being Christocentricity, evangelizing the culture, commitment to the new media, a reliance on the mystical body, affirmative orthodoxy, and leading with beauty. So today, Bishop Barron and I are going to discuss the 7th of the 8 principles, and that being a collaborative apostolate. So Bishop, maybe to start, what do we mean by having a collaborative apostolate?
Well, one in which the clergy and the laity work together. I think one of the great principles of Vatican II was precisely this. So calling all the baptized to holiness, the universal call to holiness, and to mission. Clergy and laity have distinct vocations and roles, but they are meant to be complementary, and they're meant to be collaborative. And so I think, again, to my mind, Vatican II includes a lot of unrealized dreams. And that's one of them, in my judgment, that we've not really found this point of collaboration between clergy and laity. We'll come back to maybe a little bit later in our conversation, but I think Word on Fire, as it's unfolded as a ministry, is a very good example of lay people and clergy working together. Because Word on Fire is, and you're a good example, is really dominated by lay people. Most of those involved are laity, but with a very strong direction from the clergy. But Vatican II was speaking much more broadly about the whole life of the church, how the ordained and the lay faithful work together for the building up of the kingdom.
Yeah, and maybe just to kind of dive into it as well is kind of to discuss the theological and practical roles of both priests and lay people. So especially in terms of evangelization and in terms of our desire to see a movement, what role do priests have in regard to evangelization?
Well, of course, Vatican II talks about the priesthood in terms of priest, prophet, king, right? Those who sanctify, who teach, and who govern. So I see priests as having this very important role sacramentally as those who sanctify the church. So people come to the sacraments, and the priests typically preside at the sacraments. They make holy the people. And that is extremely important, isn't it? Is we don't just rely on our natural gifts. Grace builds on nature indeed, but we need a sanctified people to carry out the work of the church. How do you get sanctified? Through the sacraments. The sacraments are administered by the bishops and priests. The priest is also a prophet. He's a teacher. So again, not just our natural intellectual perceptions, but now a heightened perception based upon proper instruction in the faith. Where does that come from? The preaching and the teaching of the priests. And then king. So who sort of governs and directs the operation of the church? Well, now go from the Pope through the archbishops and bishops around the world and through the priests. In many ways, giving this kingly direction to the missionary work of the church. So that's the role of the clergy, indispensable. Those who've been ordained for this type of leadership. Now, the laity, and this is where Vatican II, I think, really shines, and these texts are underappreciated still 50 years later. The laity, to go out into their natural habitat, which is the world. So the arena of government and of journalism and of communication and of business and of finance and economy, et cetera, sports, entertainment, all these different arenas that the laity naturally inhabit. But now that they've been sanctified and instructed and given kingly direction, now off they go to sanctify the world. And see, what I love about this, Jared, is you say, okay, now which of those two is more important? Well, it's a dumb question, right? Because without the laity, well, as Newman said, the church would look pretty funny without them, But so if we're sanctifying and we're governing and we're teaching, yes, the laity, so that they can transform the world, Or no, it's all about the laity. Yeah, but a laity that's improperly instructed, not sanctified, not governed, won't know how to sanctify the world. And so it's the two in this very tight, mutually influential collaboration that will bring about what the church wants, which is the kingdom of God.
Yeah, and you're touching on something that has been an interesting outlay since Vatican II, which we've had kind of this problem of extremes. So on one side, you have clericalism, where every aspect of church life, evangelization, catechesis, you name it, all lands on the ordained. But then on the other side, you have sort of this blurring of charisms, where the laity begin to take on the roles of the ordained and really forget their calls to be that seed of the word in everyday life of really what their role is. Maybe you can speak to maybe why that happened and how we can sort of dodge that problem.
Yeah, and good, Jared. You're raising a lot of good and they're complicated questions. But one of the issues, as you're hinting there, is the so-called clericalization of the laity. And I think it was a mistake that happened in the years immediately after Vatican II, especially in the West. Namely, we read full involvement of the laity as, let's make the laity as much like priests as we can. So to draw the laity into the kind of interior life of the church, into the ministerial life of the church. Now, again, this is where it gets complicated. There is a legitimate role for the laity in those positions. So I don't deny that for a second. But the primary focus of Vatican II was not to clericalize the laity, but to send the laity into their natural habitat, which is the saculum, right? It's the world, the secular world. And to make the secular world sacred, to make the secular world a place where God is rightly praised. And that's the primary role of the laity. That's their natural arena of activity. And so if we hyper-clericalize the laity, we undermine this essential task, or we convince the laity, oh, that's what it means to be fully involved in the church, is to join one of the ministries. Well, again, that's good and fine, and there's plenty of room for that. But the primary thing is not to be drawn into the ministerial life of the church. It's to go out and transfigure the world. And I think that teaching has still not been sufficiently appreciated.
Yeah, and really, I mean, JP2 really touched on that pretty heavily. I mean, he really called the lay people to go out into the world, and in particular in his writings in Christe Fidelis Laici, there's a great quote in there that I brought up a lot at the parish I used to work at. It says that a new state of affairs today, both in the church and in social, economic, political, and cultural life, calls with a particular urgency for the action of the lay faithful. If lack of commitment is always unacceptable, the present time renders it even more so. It is not permissible for anyone to remain idle. That's a pretty powerful wording.
Yep. And you're right, and St. John Paul II is a pivotal figure here, because think of the young Karl Wojtyła, right, who was very connected to the young laity that he was serving, and would take these kids on the kayaking and camping trips and all that. And he was not doing clergy formation. I think some of the young people that followed him became priests, but most of them did not. He was forming laity in the great tradition of the church so that they might, as indeed they did, become great Catholic scientists and great Catholic journalists, great Catholic business leaders, and great Catholic political leaders. So what eventually happened under the papacy of John Paul II is a lot of these people that he had formed took these roles in the wider society. And so that very much informed, I think, his vision of clergy and laity. And mind you, he was a present figure at Vatican II. So Wojtyła helps to write, especially Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world, which has this emphasis very strongly. So I think John Paul II is a key to understanding how this thing works.
So then how might you encourage the laity to both embrace their call as evangelists, which go beyond the parish boundary, but then also to balance that role with their role in the parish?
Well, again, what if every morning a baptized layperson woke up and said, my primary task today, in whatever field, I'm going off to work in business and economy and in politics and culture, whatever it is. My primary task today is not to make money, though nothing wrong with making money. My primary task is not to increase the profile of my company, and that's fine. My primary task is to sanctify the arena that I've been assigned to bring some of the holiness of Christ to what I'm doing. Now, that could take a lot of forms. That could take the form of direct or indirect evangelization, right? Maybe drawing people that work with you closer to Christ. But I think more typically, in the decisions you make as a banker, as a businessman, as a owner of a sports team or whatever it is, that all my decisions are conditioned by my Christian faith. That I'm going to make this particular business, finance, whatever decision in light of the gospel, right? The famous Cardinal Cardine, principle of see, judge, and act, right? What do I see as I look at my world? How do I judge it in light of the gospel? And then how do I act? What if that was the first context for your life in the world? And money making and all the other things, fine, but they would cluster around that central concern. So I might urge people, go back to Cardinal Cardine, look him up on the web, Cardijn, Cardinal Cardine. See, judge, and act, and let that inform all that you do in your work in the world.
Yeah, one of my favorite visions of this, or kind of a way to see it, is what you've spoken a lot about, is not only recognizing the seeds of the word in the culture, but also being willing to plant those seeds. And obviously that goes back to the parable of the sower. And I do think that a lot of people perhaps fear that no matter what, they're going to plant these seeds and there's always going to be weeds, right? That they are going to put all this work forth and all of this effort and this time. But maybe some real practical advice on how to deal with that, but then also how to keep going.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that with the weeds and the weeds. So it always goes. So it always has gone. We should never be demoralized by that. We're called upon to do in our present situation what we can do. Not to fuss or complain about, all the obstacles. Well, there've always been obstacles. There have always been obstacles in any situation. Again, look at Karol Wojtyła. You want obstacles. Here's someone up against the two greatest tyrannies of modern times, and yet sowed the seeds of the gospel very effectively in that environment. So no matter who's listening to me now, it's not as bad as it was for young Karol Wojtyła, and look what he managed to do. So the wheat and the weeds thing, that's a good principle. Don't worry about that. Just sow as you can. Practical advice. I go back to Cardinal Cardine. Keep, see, judge, and act in your mind all throughout the day. So in other words, Christians should not be naive. They got their eyes wide open. What's going on? What's happening here? And to see it, clearly, clear-eyed vision of both sin and grace. What's happening? How do I judge what's happening now in light of gospel principles? Maybe take the gospel of the week before at Mass. That's a way of bringing it very concretely. So whatever that gospel was, and remember it. Now, how is that helping me see and judge what's going on? And then act. Okay, in light of that judgment, what's one thing I can do to bring the gospel to this situation? I think that's a very concrete way to do it. I've talked too about wearing a sign of the faith on your person, or letting people know, not in a browbeating way, but letting people know that you're a Catholic. And that might lead them to say, okay, where'd that come from? Tell me more about that. As they watch you move through the day, they say, that guy's a Catholic. I wonder if his faith is informing him. Those are concrete ways that you can sow seeds of the gospel. But basically, it's in your decision making. How and why are you deciding? And I say to myself, it's a deeply challenging question. As I move through my day, see, that's a way to examine your conscience at the end of the day. As I move through my day, how did I decide what to do? Was it motivated by the gospel? Did I see, judge, and act according to the gospel? Or was I deciding based on some other principle of my career, my ego, whatever it is? So I'd say those are a couple of things, Jared, I think that can make it concrete.
Yeah. And one thing that I thought about when you were talking was, in Sherry Waddell's book on discipleship, she talks about the first stage of this getting a person to become a disciple is initial trust. And it reminded me of what John Paul II would say of, if you're a lawyer, be a great lawyer. If you're a soccer player, be a great soccer player. And I noticed this even, in my own way of when I go to the gym, right? If I'm working hard and I'm there hanging out with the guys and helping them as well and doing all I can to be great in that specific arena, that initial trust, that sort of step one of getting a person to recognize there's something in this person that I want to be around, it's a profoundly effective way to begin that conversation.
No, precisely right. And that's right what Sherry Waddell says about trust. Long before we get to indoctrination or to teaching or to, catechesis, it's just that simple thing of, okay, do I trust this person enough to take the next step? And what's happened, of course, sadly in the last, 25 years is the church has sadly given a lot of reason for people not to trust. Think of the scandals of the last 25 years. That's one dimension of that terrible tragedy, is that it's undermined a lot of our evangelical power. But yeah, someone looking at you, working out at the gym, and say, okay, that guy seems like he's, a normal guy and sort of got it together and seems happy. That's the step of trust, that might be the first step.
So then, in light of the movement, how do you see these roles of ordained and laity really collaborating and working together?
Well, that's my dream, Jared, is to take what we've been talking about here, which is the Vatican II vision, and with the Word on Fire movement is try to make that very concrete. My hope, and I know you're so involved in this now, is kind of directing a lot of it, is to give people who are going to join the movement the tools and the resources they need to bring the gospel to bear in their everyday life. I want to draw laity through the web, probably through the internet first, into this first thoughtful and prayerful consideration of the gospel, and then to give them the tools, intellectual, moral, and otherwise, to bring the gospel to bear in their daily life so that they have a lifestyle of evangelization. That's my hope. So all the people who join us would be, in every aspect of the life of the world. Good. Now, bring the gospel into that arena. So that's the whole purpose of the movement. The movement is a very, I'd say, Vatican II inspired outreach.
And maybe there's an example. You mentioned one, obviously, being Word on Fire. How is it concretely, is this an example of that collaboration that's been done really well?
Yeah, in Word on Fire, it's interesting now to think about this because we've been talking now more generally about the Vatican II vision of the clergy teaching, informing, and governing, and then the laity going out to the world. But there's also that middle ground that I alluded to, and Word on Fire, I think, fits in there. So I found Word on Fire now a long time ago. So I'm a priest, and I discerned this mission, to evangelize through the media. Father Steve, has been a great former student of mine and a great friend, and he is an early collaborator. So we have these two priests involved. Cardinal George, so the high priest of Chicago at the time, recognized the importance of it, drew Father Steve into it. So there's a very clerical dimension, if you want. However, from the beginning, lay people in great numbers were drawn to Word on Fire, including yourself in time, And if you look at our rundown of personnel, the overwhelming majority of people are lay people. Now, doing their work out in the world, yes, more broadly, but I'd see all the laity at Word on Fire as participating in the mission that Father Steve and I have of preaching, teaching, and sanctifying and governing. So it's kind of a middle zone. It would be similar to people who do join a parish staff, for example, lay people that participate in the priest ministry. Word on Fire, I think, is the Word on Fire people, directly involved with us are kind of in that middle zone. But it's been, to me, one of the most joyful and positive aspects of Word on Fire that we've collaborated so well. It's been a very non-competitive sort of thing. I've never sensed from the laity a desire to, push me out of my proper role as the founder and leader, or Father Steve, And the laity, I think, have just found great joy in participating in this ministry. So it's, I think, a good model of how this can happen.
Well, now it's time for our listener question. Remember, if you have a question for Bishop Barron, be sure to go to askbishopbarron.com and record your question from any device, and perhaps you'll be featured on one of our upcoming episodes. Today's question comes from Ryan in Omaha regarding his own discernment and how to serve God.
Hi, my name's Ryan and I'm from Omaha. I'm 15 and for the past month or so now I've been trying to discern the priesthood. My question is, how can someone my age discern his calling, what his calling might be, and what steps could I take now to do a good job as a priest in the future, if that's what God's calling me to do?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. And, a lot of my time as a priest was spent in the seminary helping people discern. You're a young guy, you're 15, but, God calls people at all kinds of different ages. I'd say a couple things. First of all, make sure you're going to Mass every day. Go to Mass, the source and summit of the Christian life, and go with that question in your heart of, Lord, what do you want me to do? Lord, help me to see. And then really pay attention to the readings at Mass, really pay attention to the movement of grace in your heart. So go to Mass every day. Second thing I would say is find a good spiritual director. So maybe it's your parish priest, I don't know if you're a pastor or it's a priest that you know, but find a priest whom you could meet with on a fairly regular basis and kind of just talk through this question. It's good to bounce these ideas off somebody else. Have a focused prayer life. So the Mass first and foremost. But, at your stage of life, I wouldn't necessarily say you start praying the whole Liturgy of the Hours, but maybe to spend a certain amount of time in the morning or the evening with the Scripture, with the Rosary, with the Jesus Prayer, and asking that very pointed question. Here's the last thing I'd say, and again, I don't know precisely what your situation is, but if you could get involved in some kind of ministry, maybe it's at your parish, some outreach the parish has, ask your parish priest, there's some way you could just participate in that. Maybe it's helping, people your own age, people who are in the confirmation process. I don't know how old they are in your diocese, but maybe you could help some of them as they're moving through it. So those are a couple things I'd mention at your stage of development. But thank the Lord for the call. Thank the Lord for this feeling you have. And then, patiently cultivate it.
Well, thanks so much for tuning in to the Word on Fire show. Be sure to check our website, www.wordonfireshow.com, for several links regarding the topic we discussed today. And as many of you know, Lent is just around the corner, and we're offering a free daily Lent reflection booklet at wordonfireshow.com/Lent. All you'll need to do is pay for the shipping cost. Again, that's wordonfireshow.com/Lent. Thanks in advance, and God bless, and we'll see you back here next week on the Word on Fire show.